Lieutenant Sarah Chun walked into the mess hall at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado with her head held high, despite the exhaustion weighing down her shoulders. The morning briefing had run long, and she was already 10 minutes behind her usual lunch schedule. The cafeteria buzzed with conversations from sailors, officers, and special operations personnel grabbing their midday meals. Sarah had earned her lieutenant bars through years of dedicated service in naval intelligence. Her petite frame and quiet demeanor often led people to underestimate her capabilities, but she had proven herself time and again in high-pressure situations. She specialized in threat assessment and had provided critical intelligence that had saved countless lives during overseas operations. As she moved through the serving line, Sarah noticed the familiar groups forming around different tables. The regular Navy personnel clustered together, sharing stories about upcoming deployments and shore leave plans. The officers sat at their usual spots near the windows, discussing administrative matters and training schedules. And, at the far corner, she spotted the table that always drew attention, the Navy SEALs. The SEAL table was occupied by 6 men, all displaying the confident swagger that came with being part of the most elite special operations unit in the Navy. Their conversation was animated, punctuated by bursts of laughter that carried across the room. Sarah had worked with several SEAL teams during her intelligence assignments, providing crucial battlefield information and threat analysis that helped shape their missions. She selected her usual meal, grilled chicken, steamed vegetables, and brown rice, and looked around for an empty table. The mess hall was particularly crowded today, with multiple units having overlapping lunch breaks. Most tables were full, and the few available seats were scattered among groups she didn't know well. As Sarah balanced her tray and water bottle, she noticed an empty chair at a table near the SEALs. The table was occupied by 3 junior enlisted sailors who seemed engaged in a discussion about their upcoming training exercise. She approached politely, making eye contact with one of the sailors. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" she asked, gesturing to the empty chair. The young petty officer looked up and quickly recognized her rank insignia. "No, ma'am. Please go ahead," he said, starting to stand in respect. "Please, don't get up. I'm just grabbing a quick lunch," Sarah replied with a smile, settling into the chair and unwrapping her silverware. The conversation at the nearby SEAL table had grown louder, and snippets of their discussion drifted over. They were talking about a recent training exercise where they had worked with intelligence personnel to practice hostage rescue scenarios. The exercise had been challenging, requiring precise coordination between the assault team and the intelligence analysts who provided real-time updates on enemy positions. "The intel support was solid," one of the SEALs was saying. "Made all the difference in how we approached the compound." "Yeah, but you know how it is with some of these intelligence officers," another voice chimed in. "Half of them have never seen real action. They sit behind desks pushing papers and think they understand what we deal with out there." Sarah continued eating, accustomed to hearing such comments. The relationship between intelligence personnel and special operations teams could sometimes be tense, especially when people didn't understand the critical role that accurate information played in mission success. She had heard similar remarks throughout her career and had learned to focus on proving her value through her work rather than engaging in debates about it. The junior sailors at her table were discussing their own upcoming deployment, talking about the training they still needed to complete and the gear they were required to pack. Sarah listened with interest, remembering her own early days in the Navy when everything seemed both exciting and overwhelming. The learning curve was steep, but the sense of purpose and camaraderie made it worthwhile. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking," one of the sailors said, lowering his voice slightly, "what's it like working in intelligence? I've been thinking about cross-rating when my current enlistment is up." Sarah appreciated the question and took a moment to consider her response. "It's challenging work," she said. "You spend a lot of time analyzing information from multiple sources, trying to piece together accurate pictures of complex situations. The responsibility is significant because the intelligence you provide directly impacts the safety and success of the people in the field." The sailor nodded thoughtfully. "Do you ever get to deploy with the teams you support?" "Sometimes," Sarah replied. "I've been forward deployed several times to provide direct support for special operations." It gives you a much better understanding of how your intelligence work translates into real-world applications. At the SEAL table, the conversation had shifted to discussing different types of missions they had conducted. One of them, a petty officer first class with the build of a linebacker, was describing a particularly challenging insertion they had performed in rough seas. His voice carried the authority of someone who had faced genuine danger and emerged successfully. "The thing about our job," he was saying, "is that when everything goes wrong, we're the ones who have to adapt and overcome. We don't have the luxury of calling for backup or waiting for perfect conditions. We make it work with whatever we have." His teammates nodded in agreement, sharing their own stories of overcoming obstacles during training and deployments. The pride in their voices was evident, and Sarah understood it. The SEALs had earned their reputation through some of the most demanding training in the military, and their success rate on dangerous missions spoke for itself. However, the conversation took a different turn when one of the SEALs noticed Sarah sitting nearby. Petty Officer Mark Rodriguez, a burly man with sleeve tattoos visible beneath his rolled-up uniform sleeves, glanced over at her table and then back to his teammates. "Speaking of intelligence support," he said, his voice carrying a hint of mockery, "looks like we got ourselves a real expert right over there." He gestured subtly in Sarah's direction, causing his teammates to turn and look. Sarah felt the shift in attention, but continued eating, hoping the moment would pass. She had learned that engaging with personnel who seemed determined to create confrontation rarely led to positive outcomes. Her strategy was usually to maintain her professionalism and let her work speak for itself. But Rodriguez wasn't finished. "I bet she's never set foot outside the wire," he continued, his voice getting slightly louder. "Probably thinks warfare is something you study in textbooks and PowerPoint presentations." The other SEALs exchanged glances, some looking uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. Sarah could feel tension building at her table as the junior sailors beside her became aware of what was happening. The mess hall's background noise seemed to fade as more people began to notice the developing situation. Sarah took a deep breath and continued eating, her military training kicking in. She had faced discrimination and skepticism before, both as a woman in a male-dominated field and as an intelligence officer working with combat units. Her approach had always been to remain calm and professional, letting her competence speak for itself rather than engaging in confrontational exchanges. The junior sailors at her table looked increasingly uncomfortable, unsure whether they should say something or pretend they hadn't heard the comments. Sarah gave them a reassuring smile, silently communicating that she was handling the situation and they shouldn't feel obligated to intervene. Rodriguez, however, seemed emboldened by what he interpreted as her lack of response. "You know what the problem is with some of these intel officers," he said, now speaking loudly enough that most of the nearby tables could hear. "They get their rank handed to them through college programs and think they know what real military service looks like." This comment hit particularly close to home because Sarah had indeed received her commission through the Naval Reserve Officers Training Corps program during college. However, what Rodriguez didn't know was the path that had led her to that opportunity and the experiences that had shaped her military career. Sarah finished her last bite of chicken and carefully placed her fork on her tray. She stood up slowly, gathering her tray and belongings with deliberate calm. The junior sailors at her table looked up at her with a mixture of concern and curiosity, clearly wondering how she would respond to the increasingly direct challenge to her credibility and qualifications. As Sarah prepared to leave, Rodriguez made one final comment that would prove to be a significant miscalculation. "That's right, just walk away." Typical officer response when someone calls out the truth about desk jockeys playing soldier. Sarah stopped walking and turned around to face the SEAL table. Her movement was fluid and controlled, displaying none of the anger or defensiveness that Rodriguez had apparently expected to provoke. Instead, her expression was calm and measured, the look of someone who was about to set the record straight in a way that no one in the mess hall would forget. The silence that followed was complete. Every conversation in the room had stopped, and all attention was focused on the small intelligence officer and the table full of elite special operations personnel. What happened next would become a story that spread throughout the base and beyond, a reminder that assumptions based on appearances could be dangerously wrong. Sarah set her tray back down on the table and walked calmly toward the seal table, her posture straight and her stride confident. She wasn't approaching with aggression or anger, but with the quiet authority of someone who had something important to say. The seals watched her approach, their earlier bravado giving way to curiosity about how this situation would resolve. Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, a smirk on his face as he prepared for what he assumed would be an emotional outburst or an attempt at asserting rank-based authority. What he got instead would challenge everything he thought he knew about the woman approaching his table and force him to confront the assumptions he had made about her background and qualifications. Sarah approached the seal table with measured steps, her hands relaxed at her sides. The entire mess hall had fallen silent, creating an atmosphere so tense that the only sounds were the distant hum of kitchen equipment and the soft footfalls of her regulation boots against the polished floor. Rodriguez watched her approach with a mixture of amusement and curiosity, still convinced that he was about to witness either an emotional breakdown or an ineffective attempt to pull rank. When Sarah reached the table, she stopped directly in front of Rodriguez and looked him in the eye. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and controlled, carrying easily across the silent room without any hint of anger or defensiveness. "Petty Officer Rodriguez," she began, reading his name tape with deliberate precision. "You mentioned that some intelligence officers get their rank handed to them and don't understand real military service. You suggested that I've never been outside the wire or faced actual combat situations. I'd like to address those assumptions." Rodriguez shifted slightly in his chair, his smirk beginning to fade as he recognized that this wasn't going to unfold the way he had expected. The other SEALs at the table exchanged glances, some beginning to look uncomfortable with the situation their teammate had created. "Before I received my commission," Sarah continued, her voice steady and professional, "I spent 4 years as an enlisted intelligence specialist. I started as an E1, just like many of the people in this room. I earned every promotion through performance, dedication, and proven competence in increasingly challenging assignments." The first crack in Rodriguez's confidence appeared as he processed this information. Most officers he had encountered had come straight from college into commissioned roles, but Sarah was describing a different path entirely. "During my enlisted service," she went on, "I completed 3 combat deployments in Afghanistan. I spent 14 months forward deployed with special operations teams, including 2 SEAL teams, providing real-time intelligence analysis during direct action missions." A murmur of surprise rippled through the mess hall. The idea of an intelligence officer, particularly a female officer, having extensive combat experience was challenging the preconceptions of many listeners. "On my second deployment," Sarah said, her voice never wavering, "I was attached to SEAL Team 7 during Operation Enduring Freedom. We were conducting village clearance operations in Helmand Province, and I was responsible for providing tactical intelligence and threat assessment during compound searches." Rodriguez's teammates were now staring at him with expressions that ranged from surprise to concern. They were beginning to realize that their colleague had picked a fight with someone whose background was far different from what any of them had assumed. Sarah continued her account with the precision of someone who had lived through the experiences she was describing. "During a night raid on a suspected Taliban safe house, our team came under heavy fire from a coordinated ambush. The primary target had been moved, and we found ourselves in a complex attack with enemy fighters positioned in multiple buildings surrounding our position. The mess hall remained completely silent, with personnel from all branches and specialties listening intently to an account of combat operations that few of them had experienced firsthand. While the team established defensive positions," Sarah said, "I worked with the radio operator to coordinate close air support and extract intelligence from materials we had recovered from the target building. The information I was able to analyze in real time revealed that we were facing a much larger enemy force than intelligence had indicated, and that they had positioned fighters specifically to cut off our planned extraction route." Rodriguez was no longer smirking. His expression had shifted to one of growing unease as he began to understand the magnitude of his miscalculation. "Based on my analysis of the enemy communications we intercepted and the tactical situation on the ground," Sarah continued, I recommended an alternate extraction route that would avoid the prepared ambush positions. The team leader accepted my recommendation, and we successfully extracted without casualties, despite being significantly outnumbered. She paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. The after-action report from that mission specifically cited the intelligence analysis provided during the engagement as being critical to the team's survival and mission success. One of the other SEALs at the table, a senior petty officer who had been listening with growing respect, leaned forward slightly. "What team were you with?" he asked quietly. "SEAL Team 7, Bravo Platoon," Sarah replied. "Under Lieutenant Commander Harrison. The mission was designated Operation Neptune Strike." The senior petty officer's eyes widened with recognition. "I know that mission," he said, his voice carrying a note of awe. "The intelligence analyst who saved that team became legendary. We studied that operation in our advanced tactics course." Rodriguez looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. The confident swagger that had characterized his earlier comments had completely evaporated, replaced by the dawning realization that he had challenged someone whose combat credentials far exceeded his own. Sarah wasn't finished. "After my third deployment, I was selected for the Naval Reserve Officers Training Corps program based on my demonstrated performance in combat situations and my potential for leadership roles in the intelligence community. I didn't have my rank handed to me. I earned my commission the same way I earned my enlisted promotions, through proven competence under pressure." She turned slightly to address not just Rodriguez, but the entire table of SEALs. "Since becoming an officer, I've continued to deploy with special operations teams. I've provided intelligence support for direct action raids in 3 different combat zones, participated in over 40 high-risk operations, and have been awarded the Bronze Star Medal with Combat V for actions during a hostage rescue mission in Syria." The mention of the Bronze Star with Combat V, an award that recognized valor in combat, sent another wave of murmurs through the mess hall. This was not an award given lightly, and it indicated that Sarah had not only been present during combat operations but had distinguished herself through exceptional performance under fire. "The hostage rescue mission you mentioned," one of the other SEALs asked hesitantly. "Was that Operation Guardian Angel?" Sarah nodded. "I was the intelligence officer who identified the location where the hostages were being held and provided the real-time updates that allowed the assault team to successfully extract all 4 prisoners without casualties." Rodriguez's face had gone pale. Operation Guardian Angel was well known throughout the special operations community as one of the most successful hostage rescues in recent years. The intelligence work that had made the mission possible was considered a masterpiece of tactical analysis and battlefield intelligence. "During that operation," Sarah continued, "when the assault team encountered unexpected resistance, I left the command post to provide forward intelligence support. I spent 6 hours in an active combat zone, analyzing enemy communications and providing tactical updates that helped the team adapt to changing conditions on the ground." The senior SEAL who had recognized Operation Neptune Strike was now looking at Rodriguez with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. "Jesus Christ, Rodriguez," he said quietly. "Do you have any idea who you just challenged?" Sarah held up a hand to prevent the situation from escalating further. "I'm not telling you this to embarrass anyone or to prove how tough I am," she said, her voice maintaining its calm, professional tone. "I'm sharing this because the assumptions that were made about me are the same assumptions that get people killed in the field." She looked directly at Rodriguez, her expression serious but not hostile. "When you assume that someone doesn't belong or doesn't understand the realities of military service based on their appearance or their current position, you create dangerous blind spots. The intelligence officer you dismiss as a desk jockey might be the person whose analysis keeps you alive on your next mission." Rodriguez finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "But I hope you'll remember this conversation the next time you're tempted to make assumptions about someone's qualifications or experience." She turned to address the broader group of SEALs at the table. "I've had the privilege of working with many SEAL teams over the years, and I have tremendous respect for the training you've completed and the risks you take. All I ask is for the same respect in return, based on proven performance rather than preconceived notions." The senior SEAL nodded emphatically. "Ma'am, you absolutely have that respect." And Rodriguez here is going to make sure that everyone in our unit understands what just happened here today. Sarah smiled slightly, the first time her expression had softened since the confrontation began. I appreciate that. And I want you all to know that despite this unfortunate exchange, I'm always available to support special operations missions. That's what I'm here for. The atmosphere in the mess hall was slowly beginning to return to normal, though the conversations that resumed were markedly different from those that had been interrupted. People were processing what they had just witnessed, and many were reflecting on their own assumptions about their fellow service members. As Sarah turned to return to her table, the senior SEAL at Rodriguez's table stood up. Chief Petty Officer James Mitchell was a 20-year veteran whose weathered face bore the marks of countless deployments and dangerous missions. His movement caused the entire table to fall silent again, and his action drew the attention of everyone still watching the unfolding drama. "Lieutenant Shun," Mitchell called out, his voice carrying the authority that came with decades of military service. "If I may, I'd like to add something to this conversation." Sarah paused and turned back, curious about what the senior enlisted man wanted to say. She had learned over the years that veteran NCOs often had perspectives that were worth hearing, regardless of the circumstances. Mitchell stepped away from the table, positioning himself where his voice would carry clearly throughout the mess hall. "I've been a SEAL for 18 years, he began, his voice steady and commanding. "I've worked with dozens of intelligence officers during that time, and I can tell you that the quality of intelligence support can make the difference between a successful mission and a disaster." He looked around the room, making eye contact with personnel from various units and specialties. What Rodriguez did here today was wrong, but it's not unique. Too many of us make assumptions about people based on their job, their rank, or their appearance instead of taking the time to understand their actual qualifications and experience. Rodriguez sat with his head down, clearly wishing he could disappear. His embarrassment was evident to everyone in the room, and Mitchell's public commentary was making the situation even more uncomfortable for him. "I want to share something with all of you," Mitchell continued. 3 years ago, I was the team chief for a direct action mission in Syria. Our target was a high-value individual who was believed to be coordinating attacks against coalition forces. The mission planning took weeks, and our intelligence officer was a young lieutenant who looked like he could barely shave. Several people in the mess hall chuckled quietly at Mitchell's description, recognizing the type of young officer he was describing. "My first impression was that we were stuck with some inexperienced kid who would probably provide textbook analysis that wouldn't help us in the real world," Mitchell admitted. "I was completely wrong." He paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. That young lieutenant had spent months analyzing the target's patterns, his associates, and his operating methods. When we got on the ground, the situation was nothing like what our preliminary intelligence had suggested. The target had moved his operation, changed his security procedures, and was using completely different routes than we had expected. The mess hall remained silent, with everyone listening intently to Mitchell's account. "That lieutenant adapted his analysis in real time," Mitchell said. "He identified new patterns, tracked the target's movements through electronic intelligence, and provided updates that allowed us to successfully locate and capture our objective. Without his work, that mission would have been a complete failure." Mitchell turned to look directly at Rodriguez. "The point is that I almost dismissed someone whose expertise was exactly what we needed, based on nothing more than my preconceived notions about what an intelligence officer should look like or how much experience they should have." He then shifted his attention to Sarah. "Lieutenant Shun, your reputation in the special operations community is well known among those of us who pay attention to such things. The work you did during Operation Guardian Angel saved American lives and demonstrated the kind of intelligence support that every team hopes to have." Sarah nodded in acknowledgement of the compliment, but remained silent, allowing Mitchell to continue his address to the room. "What happened here today should serve as a reminder to all of us," Mitchell said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "In the military, we depend on each other for our lives and our mission success. When we make assumptions about people's capabilities based on superficial characteristics, we create unnecessary divisions and miss opportunities to learn from each other." A young petty officer at a nearby table raised his hand tentatively. Mitchell nodded for him to speak. "Chief, How do we avoid making those kinds of mistakes? The sailor asked. Sometimes it's hard to know someone's background unless they tell you about it. Mitchell smiled approvingly at the question. That's exactly the right thing to ask, he said. The answer is simple, but not always easy. Treat everyone with respect until they prove they don't deserve it. Ask questions about people's experience and background instead of making assumptions. And remember that in the military, everyone has a story. Some of those stories might surprise you. He gestured toward Sarah. Lieutenant Chen didn't have to share her background with us today. She could have simply ignored Rodriguez's comments and walked away. But she chose to educate all of us about the assumptions we make and the consequences those assumptions can have. Another voice spoke up from across the room. Ma'am, what would you want people to know about working with intelligence personnel? Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. I think the most important thing is to understand that intelligence work is a collaborative effort, she said. We're not trying to tell you how to do your jobs. We're trying to provide you with information that helps you do your jobs more effectively and more safely. She walked closer to the center of the room, addressing the broader audience that had gathered. Good intelligence officers understand that you're the experts in your fields. A SEAL knows more about direct action tactics than I ever will. A pilot knows more about aviation than I could learn in a lifetime. My job is to understand the threat environment and provide information that helps you apply your expertise more effectively. A Marine corporal sitting near the back of the room raised his hand. Ma'am, have you ever had situations where the people you were supporting didn't trust your intelligence? Absolutely, Sarah replied without hesitation. And sometimes they were right to be skeptical. Intelligence analysis isn't perfect, and I've made mistakes. The key is to be honest about the limitations of your information and to work together to verify and refine your understanding of the situation. She glanced back at Rodriguez, who was still sitting quietly at his table. The best working relationships I've had with operational teams have been when everyone felt comfortable asking questions, challenging assumptions, and sharing information freely. That only happens when there's mutual respect and understanding. Mitchell nodded approvingly. That's exactly right. And it works both ways. Some of the best intelligence I've ever received has come from working with analysts who weren't afraid to tell me when my tactical plans didn't account for important factors they had identified. A senior airman from the Air Force asked, how do you build that kind of trust when you're working with a new team? Sarah smiled at the question. It takes time and effort from everyone involved. As an intelligence officer, I try to learn as much as I can about the operational requirements and constraints that the team faces. I ask a lot of questions about their procedures, their equipment, and their experiences. And I'm always honest about what I know and what I don't know. From the operational side, Mitchell added, we have a responsibility to give intelligence personnel the information they need to do their jobs effectively. That means sharing our observations from the field, explaining how the intelligence products we receive are helpful or not helpful, and being open about our operational limitations. Rodriguez finally looked up from his table. Ma'am, Chief, I think I understand now why what I did was so wrong. I made assumptions without knowing anything about the person I was criticizing, and I created exactly the kind of division that makes it harder for everyone to do their jobs effectively. Sarah walked over to Rodriguez's table and extended her hand. Petty Officer Rodriguez, I appreciate your willingness to acknowledge that, and I want you to know that I hold no grudges about what happened here. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we learn from them. Rodriguez stood up and shook her hand, his relief evident. Thank you, ma'am. And I want you to know that if my team ever has the opportunity to work with you, we'll consider ourselves fortunate. The tension that had filled the mess hall was finally beginning to dissipate, replaced by a sense that something important had been accomplished. The conversation had evolved from a confrontation into a teaching moment that would likely be remembered and discussed for years to come. Chief Mitchell looked around the room one more time. I want to end with this, he said. Every person in this room volunteered to serve their country. Every person here has made sacrifices and commitments that most Americans will never understand. We may have different jobs, different backgrounds, and different experiences, but we're all part of the same team. He paused to let his words sink in. When we tear each other down based on assumptions and prejudices, we weaken that team. When we build each other up and learn from each other's expertise, we become stronger and more effective. The applause that followed was spontaneous and widespread, coming from personnel throughout the mess hall. It wasn't just appreciation for Mitchell's words, but recognition of the broader lesson that had emerged from the day's events. As the applause died down and the normal rhythm of the mess hall began to resume, Sarah returned to her original table where the three junior sailors were waiting with expressions of awe and admiration. They had witnessed something extraordinary, and their perspective on military leadership and professionalism had been fundamentally changed by what they had observed. "Ma'am," one of the sailors said quietly as Sarah sat down, "that was incredible. I've never seen anyone handle a situation like that with such composure and dignity." Sarah picked up her water bottle and took a sip before responding. "Thank you. But what you witnessed today wasn't really about me. It was about the importance of treating people with respect and not making assumptions about their capabilities or experiences." The second sailor, a young woman who had been considering a career change to intelligence work, leaned forward with interest. "Ma'am, you mentioned earlier that I should consider intelligence if I was interested. After seeing how you handled yourself today, I'm even more convinced that it's the right path for me." "Intelligence work can be very rewarding," Sarah replied, "but it requires dedication and continuous learning. The military is constantly evolving, and intelligence professionals have to stay ahead of new threats, new technologies, and new operational requirements." As they talked, Sarah noticed that the atmosphere throughout the mess hall had changed in subtle but important ways. Conversations at different tables seemed more inclusive, with personnel from different specialties engaging with each other more openly than she had typically observed. The incident had apparently prompted broader reflection on the relationships between different military communities. At the SEAL table, Chief Mitchell was engaged in what appeared to be a serious conversation with Rodriguez and his teammates. From their body language and expressions, it was clear that they were discussing the lessons learned from the day's events and how they would apply those lessons going forward. "Ma'am," the third sailor asked, "what advice would you give to someone who wants to build the kind of reputation you have? How do you earn respect in environments where people might initially doubt your capabilities?" Sarah considered the question carefully. It was something she had thought about extensively throughout her career, particularly during the early years when she had faced skepticism and discrimination on a regular basis. "The most important thing is to focus on competence and performance," she said. "You can't control other people's initial reactions or assumptions, but you can control how well you do your job. When you consistently deliver high-quality work and demonstrate your value to the team, respect follows naturally." She paused to gather her thoughts before continuing. "It's also important to be willing to learn from others, regardless of their rank or position. Some of the best insights I've gained about intelligence work have come from enlisted personnel who had different perspectives and experiences than I did." A few tables away, she noticed that personnel from different units were beginning to mingle more freely than usual. A group of Marines had joined a table of Navy personnel, and they appeared to be engaged in a spirited but friendly discussion about their different approaches to military operations. "The other thing I would emphasize," Sarah continued, "is the importance of humility. No one knows everything, and the moment you start thinking you have all the answers is the moment you become less effective. I've learned as much from my mistakes as I have from my successes." The young woman sailor nodded thoughtfully. "It seems like you've had to prove yourself over and over again throughout your career. Doesn't that get frustrating?" Sarah smiled at the directness of the question. "It can be frustrating sometimes, but I've learned to view it as an opportunity rather than a burden. Every time I have to prove myself, I'm also proving that women can succeed in combat roles and intelligence positions. That opens doors for the women who come after me." She gestured around the mess hall. "Look at what's happening right now. People are talking to each other who might not have before today. They're asking questions and sharing experiences instead of making assumptions. If what happened here helps even one person think differently about their fellow service members, then it was worth the discomfort of the confrontation." At that moment, Chief Mitchell approached their table. "Lieutenant Chun, I hope I'm not interrupting," he said politely. "Not at all, Chief. Please, have a seat," Sarah replied, gesturing to an empty chair. Mitchell sat down and looked at the three sailors. I hope you three understand how fortunate you are to have witnessed what happened here today. You just saw a masterclass in military leadership and professionalism. The sailors nodded enthusiastically, clearly still processing everything they had observed. Chief, Sarah said, I want you to know that I appreciate how you handled the situation. Your intervention helped turn a potentially negative incident into a learning opportunity for everyone. Mitchell shook his head. Ma'am, you handled that situation perfectly. I just provided some context that I thought the room needed to hear. Rodriguez is a good sailor who made a serious error in judgment, but he's learned from it. How is he doing? Sarah asked with genuine concern. Despite the confrontation, she felt no animosity toward Rodriguez and was interested in his well-being. He's embarrassed, as he should be, but he's also committed to making sure this kind of thing doesn't happen again, Mitchell replied. He's asked me to arrange for him to visit the intelligence center so he can learn more about the work you do and how it supports our operations. Sarah was pleased by this development. I'd be happy to give him a tour and explain our processes. Understanding each other's roles and responsibilities is essential for effective collaboration. One of the sailors at the table asked, Chief, in your experience, how common are the kinds of assumptions that Petty Officer Rodriguez made? Mitchell considered the question seriously. More common than they should be, but less common than they used to be. The military has made significant progress in breaking down barriers and prejudices, but we still have work to do. He looked around the mess hall, observing the continued interactions between different groups. What I'm seeing here today gives me hope that we're continuing to move in the right direction. People are engaging with each other differently, asking better questions, and challenging their own assumptions. Sarah noticed that the time was approaching 1,300 hours, and she would need to return to her office soon for an afternoon briefing. I hate to cut this short, but I need to get back to work. Thank you all for a very educational lunch conversation. As she stood to leave, the three sailors stood as well, showing the respect due her rank. Ma'am, thank you for sharing your experiences with us, one of them said. You've given us a lot to think about. Chief Mitchell also stood. Lieutenant, it's been an honor. I hope we have the opportunity to work together in the future. Sarah gathered her tray and began walking toward the disposal area. As she moved through the mess hall, she noticed that conversations quieted slightly as she passed, but not in the uncomfortable way that might have been expected after a confrontation. Instead, people seemed to be acknowledging her with respect and perhaps a bit of awe. At the disposal station, she was approached by a young Marine Lance Corporal who had been sitting near the back of the room during the earlier incident. Ma'am, he said quietly, I just wanted to thank you for what you did back there. I'm new to this base, and sometimes I feel like people make assumptions about me because I'm young and haven't deployed yet. Seeing how you handled yourself gives me confidence that I can earn respect through my performance. Sarah was touched by the comment. Lance Corporal, everyone starts somewhere. Focus on learning, working hard, and treating others with respect. The rest will follow. As she left the mess hall and walked back toward the intelligence center, Sarah reflected on the day's events. The confrontation with Rodriguez had been unpleasant, but the broader conversation that had emerged from it had been valuable for everyone involved. She thought about the young sailors she had spoken with, particularly the one who was considering a career in intelligence. Mentoring the next generation of military professionals was one of the most rewarding aspects of her job, and she was always pleased to see young people who were motivated to serve their country and advance their careers. The afternoon briefing she was heading to would cover intelligence requirements for an upcoming joint exercise involving multiple special operations units. As she prepared her materials, she thought about how the morning's events might influence the way different units approached their collaboration during the exercise. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. When she opened it, she found a message from Rodriguez. Ma'am, thank you for handling today's situation with such professionalism. I learned more about leadership in those few minutes than I have in months. Looking forward to visiting the Intelligence Center next week. PR, 3 weeks after the mess hall incident, the effects of that confrontation continued to ripple through Naval Amphibious Base Coronado in ways that surprised even Sarah. The story had spread far beyond the personnel who had witnessed it firsthand, becoming a teaching example that was being discussed in leadership courses and used as a case study in military professionalism workshops. Sarah was reviewing intelligence reports in her office when her assistant knocked on the door. "Ma'am, Chief Mitchell and Petty Officer Rodriguez are here for their scheduled appointment," the young petty officer announced. "Please send them in," Sarah replied, setting aside her paperwork and standing to greet her visitors. Rodriguez entered first, his posture noticeably different from the confident swagger he had displayed in the mess hall 3 weeks earlier. He walked with the bearing of someone who had learned important lessons about humility and respect. Chief Mitchell followed, offering Sarah a respectful nod as they approached her desk. "Petty Officer Rodriguez," Sarah said, extending her hand in greeting. "Thank you for following through on your commitment to learn more about intelligence operations. I appreciate you taking the time to visit." Rodriguez shook her hand firmly, making direct eye contact. "Ma'am, I want to start by apologizing again for my behavior in the mess hall. I've had a lot of time to think about what happened, and I understand how wrong my assumptions were. I appreciate that, but let's focus on moving forward," Sarah replied. "Chief Mitchell tells me you're interested in understanding how intelligence support works with special operations teams." Over the next 2 hours, Sarah provided Rodriguez and Mitchell with a comprehensive overview of intelligence operations. She explained the process of collecting information from multiple sources, analyzing threats and opportunities, and translating complex data into actionable intelligence that could be used by operational teams. Rodriguez asked thoughtful questions throughout the briefing, demonstrating a genuine desire to understand the intricacies of intelligence work. His questions revealed a growing appreciation for the complexity and importance of the intelligence mission, and his attitude showed none of the dismissive skepticism he had displayed during their first encounter. "Ma'am, I had no idea how much work goes into preparing the intelligence briefs we receive before missions," Rodriguez admitted as the presentation concluded. "I always thought they were just summaries of obvious information." Sarah smiled at his honesty. "That's a common misconception, and it's partly our fault for not doing a better job of explaining our processes. When intelligence is presented effectively, it should seem obvious and straightforward. The complexity of the analysis that goes into making it appear simple is often invisible to the end users." Chief Mitchell leaned forward in his chair. "Lieutenant, this has been incredibly educational. I think it would benefit our entire team to understand these processes better. Would it be possible to arrange similar briefings for our other personnel?" "Absolutely," Sarah replied. "In fact, I've been thinking about ways to improve collaboration between intelligence and operational units. Your visit today has given me some ideas about how we might structure more regular interactions." As they prepared to leave, Rodriguez hesitated at the door. "Ma'am, if I may ask, what made you decide to share your background so openly in the mess hall that day? You could have just ignored my comments or reported them through official channels." Sarah considered the question carefully. "I think there were several factors," she said. "First, I believe that you and the others in the room needed to understand the consequences of making unfounded assumptions about people's qualifications. Second, I thought it was important to show younger personnel that they can respond to challenges professionally without being aggressive or defensive." She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. "But, perhaps most importantly, I wanted to demonstrate that everyone has a story, and those stories are often more complex and interesting than we might assume. The military brings together people from incredibly diverse backgrounds and experiences, and we miss opportunities to learn from each other when we rely on stereotypes and preconceptions." Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "Ma'am, that day changed how I think about a lot of things. Not just about intelligence officers, but about making assumptions in general. I've started asking more questions and listening more carefully to people's answers." 2 days later, Sarah received a phone call from Captain Rebecca Martinez, the base commanding officer. "Lieutenant Shun, I understand you've been having some interesting conversations with our special operations personnel," the captain said with what sounded like amusement in her voice. "Yes, ma'am. I've been working to improve collaboration between intelligence and operational units," Sarah replied, wondering if she was in trouble for some reason. "Well, whatever you're doing, keep it up," Captain Martinez said. "I've been getting reports from multiple unit commanders about improved cooperation and communication between their personnel and the intelligence center. They're crediting the changes to some kind of leadership example you set a few weeks ago. Sarah was surprised by the scope of the impact. Ma'am, I'm pleased to hear that, though I'm not sure I deserve all the credit. I think people were ready for these kinds of conversations, and the incident in the mess hall just provided an opportunity for them to happen. Perhaps, the captain replied, but leadership is often about recognizing and seizing those opportunities. I'd like you to consider developing a formal program based on whatever approach you've been using. We could implement it base-wide and potentially share it with other installations. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Captain Martinez outlining her vision for improving inter-unit cooperation and asking Sarah to prepare a proposal for a comprehensive professional development program. After ending the call, Sarah sat back in her chair and reflected on the unexpected trajectory that had emerged from what had initially seemed like a negative confrontation. She thought about the young sailors who had witnessed the mess hall incident and how their perspectives on military leadership had been shaped by that experience. Her thoughts were interrupted by another knock on her door. This time, it was the young female sailor who had been considering a career change to intelligence work. "Ma'am, I hope I'm not bothering you," the sailor said, "but I wanted to update you on my application for intelligence specialist training." "Of course, come in," Sarah replied, gesturing to a chair. "How did the application process go?" The sailor's face lit up with excitement. "I was accepted, ma'am. I'll be starting the intelligence specialist course next month. I wanted to thank you for encouraging me to pursue this path and for showing me what's possible in this field." Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction at the news. "Congratulations. That's wonderful. You're going to find the training challenging but rewarding. And remember, if you need any guidance or advice as you progress through your career, don't hesitate to reach out." "Actually, ma'am, that's part of why I'm here," the sailor said. "I've been thinking about what you said regarding earning respect through competence and performance. Could you give me some specific advice about how to succeed in intelligence training and in my first assignments?" Sarah spent the next 30 minutes sharing practical advice about intelligence training, career development, and the importance of building professional relationships across different military specialties. She emphasized the value of continuous learning, the importance of asking questions, and the need to remain humble while building expertise. As the sailor prepared to leave, she asked one final question. "Ma'am, do you think what happened in the mess hall that day will have lasting effects on how people here think about each other?" Sarah smiled at the question. "I think it's already having those effects. I've noticed more cross-unit collaboration, more respectful interactions between personnel from different specialties, and more willingness to challenge assumptions about people's capabilities. Those are all positive developments that should continue to grow over time." That evening, Sarah attended a retirement ceremony for a senior intelligence officer who had served for 25 years. During the reception following the ceremony, she was approached by numerous personnel from various units who wanted to discuss the lessons learned from the mess hall incident and its aftermath. A young Marine captain pulled her aside and said, "Ma'am, I heard about what happened a few weeks ago, and I wanted you to know that it's changed how I approach working with other units. I've started spending more time learning about the people I work with instead of making assumptions about their capabilities." Similar conversations continued throughout the evening, with personnel sharing stories about how the incident had influenced their thinking about military professionalism, leadership, and the importance of treating colleagues with respect regardless of their background or specialty. As Sarah drove home that night, she realized that what had begun as an uncomfortable confrontation had evolved into something much more significant. The incident had become a catalyst for broader conversations about military culture, professional relationships, and the importance of recognizing and valuing the diverse experiences and expertise that different personnel brought to their shared mission. She thought about Rodriguez, who had transformed from someone who made disparaging comments based on assumptions into someone who was genuinely interested in learning about and collaborating with intelligence professionals. His willingness to acknowledge his mistakes and commit to doing better had been instrumental in turning a negative situation into a positive learning experience. The phone call from Captain Martinez about developing a formal program based on these experiences represented an opportunity to institutionalize the lessons learned and ensure that future personnel would benefit from the insights that had emerged from that day in the mess hall. As she pulled into her driveway, Sarah reflected on the unexpected ways that leadership opportunities could arise. She had simply responded to a challenging situation with professionalism and honesty, but that response had created ripple effects that were still spreading throughout the base and beyond. The story of the confrontation in the mess hall would likely continue to be told and retold, serving as a reminder that assumptions based on appearance or position could be dangerously wrong, and that treating colleagues with respect and seeking to understand their experiences was essential for effective military operations. Most importantly, it had demonstrated that individual actions, when guided by principles of respect, honesty, and professionalism, could have far-reaching positive effects on military culture and unit effectiveness. The quiet intelligence officer who had simply stood up for herself and educated her colleagues about the dangers of making assumptions had inadvertently become a catalyst for positive change that would benefit countless personnel for years to come.